Chapter 1, April 25th, 1861. The long line stretched from the Flint courthouse down the stone steps and across the green lawn. Moving forward slowly, the young men were in high spirits. They laughed and joked as if they were leaving on a picnic instead of going off to fight a war. "I'll wager we take Richmond in 3 weeks. Southerners talk big, but they can't fight. Been plowing behind horses all my life. Now I'll get me a chance to ride one. Can't hardly wait to take a shot at a live rebel." "You may be too late, boy. They say one good battle, the Confederacy'll fall apart." Tension and excitement crackled along the noisy line, but one dark-haired volunteer, small and silent, was lost in thought. Emma Edmonds tugged at her jacket and prayed, for the 10th time that day, that the scheme would work. It was plumb crazy, she knew, but she didn't care. She made up her mind, and that was that. Would they discover her secret? She'd have her answer in a few minutes. Of course, she was comfortable enough wearing men's clothes. She practically lived in rough pants and heavy shoes growing up in Canada, working with the farm hands and keeping up with the best of them. Now, at 21, she was still trim and boyish. She had a strong chin, a firm mouth, and cool blue eyes, and she'd cropped her hair short like a man's. She also knew, she'd checked earlier, that nobody bothered with physical examinations for new recruits. The Union Army was desperate for able-bodied men. They had no mind to be choosy. Still, she worried. Maybe her information was wrong. Maybe they'd see right through her masquerade. The line inched slowly along, step by step, carrying Emma past a billboard covered with recruiting posters. The words leapt out at her. "Volunteers to the rescue! Patriotism and love of country! Ruthless Southern treachery! Defend our noble Union! Vindicate the honor of our glorious flag!" She frowned at the fancy wording, all that fuss and bombast. Still, she had to admit, that was how she really felt. She and thousands of others. Bother the fancy speeches and flag-waving politicians. The fact was that alarm bells were ringing everywhere. The country was in peril and had to be saved. Only 10 days before, Abe Lincoln had asked for 75,000 volunteers. Now they were pouring in from shops and factories, mills and mines, offices, farms, and dockyards, rallying in every city, town, and village. And so were the local militias, with their fancy names and uniforms. Emma had read in the papers about Ellsworth's Avengers, Smallwood's Marylanders, Sprague's Light Cavalry. She knew of the Black Rifles, the Winslow Blues, and the Hibernian Greens. She'd seen pictures of New York's Fire Zouaves, who wore baggy red pantaloons. The Putnam Falcons of Connecticut sported white plumes on their hats. Boston's Highland Guards had uniforms of Scotch plaid. And one group, the Mozart Regiment, had marched off to battle in elegant double-breasted frock coats. But that was changing. All these units, so nobly costumed, were now being welded into a single force, wearing Federal blue. Here in Flint, where Emma lived, men were needed for the Michigan Volunteer Infantry, called the Union Grays. Emma was aching to be a nurse in a tent hospital on the battlefield, but that was dangerous work. Only male nurses were given those jobs. The line carried Emma to the foot of the courthouse steps. She climbed them slowly, her heart hammering. With each step, her anxiety grew. Certainly there were things she could do as a woman to help out. She could knit socks, roll bandages, or sew flags for the new regiments. She could work in a New England textile mill, making cloth for blankets and uniforms, or fill cartridge sacks with gunpowder at a Federal arsenal, or work in a refreshment canteen, or write letters home for the sick and wounded. Female nurses were also needed at hospitals in big cities like Philadelphia, Boston, and New York. It was all good work, important work, useful work that would trap her on the sidelines, far away from the realities of the war. But safety wasn't for Emma Edmonds. Something was driving her to do more, to play a bigger part. There was a kind of imp voice inside her, pushing her to take risks. It was the same voice that years before had dared her to climb the highest trees on the farm, to ride the most dangerous horses, to swim the river raging wild after the spring floods. Emma couldn't put this feeling into words, but she sensed that at least part of it was her father's doing. He had always wanted a son and could never forgive her for being female. She'd tried hard to please him and to win his approval, but without success. Her father had acted as though the whole thing were her fault, and his hand never softened. After Emma's mother died, his criticism and cruel tirades got worse, and when Emma was 16, she ran for her life. Taking all she owned in an old burlap sack, she fled to a country where she knew words like liberty and freedom had real meaning. That had been 5 years ago, and Emma had quickly fallen in love with her adopted land. She'd become its strong defender, and now that America was in peril, she'd have to take action. The imp voice was calling her. Somehow she had to be part of this war. She had to be right there with the fighting men. Emma, unafraid, sharing their dangers and hardships. Suddenly, she found herself in a paneled room draped with American flags. The line had carried her with it through the tall doors, and now her turn had come. With a final tug at her jacket, Emma swallowed hard and stepped to the desk. The recruiting sergeant glanced quickly at her and bent over his paper. "Name and age?" he asked mechanically. "Franklin Thompson," said Emma. 21. "Place of birth?" "St. John, Canada." The sergeant looked at Emma again, but only for a moment. In this area, many Canadians were crossing the border to join the Federal Army. He nodded and went on. "Any handicaps or infectious diseases?" "No, sir." "Civil occupation?" "Bible salesman and medical orderly. I'm hoping I can be posted to a field hospital." "Read and write?" "Yes, sir." He pushed the enlistment form over to her to sign. Taking the pen, Emma dipped it, remembering just in time to scrawl, "Franklin Thompson." The soldier scribbled on a card, handed it to her, and jerked a thumb over his shoulder. "We're short of medical help, so I'm rating you as a field nurse. Report to the supply tent for your gear and get sworn in." The huge supply tent pitched near the courthouse was chaotic, but somehow everything worked efficiently. Moving from line to line, Emma collected a blanket, boots, tin canteen, and army clothing. Then, with scores of others, she raised her hand and took the oath of service, administered by an elderly, tired-looking adjutant. "You men," he said, "are now part of the 2nd Regiment Michigan Volunteers. Report to Railway Depot tomorrow at 5 a.m. sharp. You'll go by train to Washington, where the regiment will be issued weapons and become part of the Army of the Potomac. Good luck to you all." Emma felt a great surge of relief at passing the big test. Carrying her equipment, she slipped away from the excited crowd and hurried across the trampled lawn. The line was still growing. It seemed like every young man in the state was rushing to enlist. Back at the rooming house, she dumped everything on her bed and carefully locked the door. Forcing herself to stay calm, she began the magic change. Trousers, shirt, jacket, and boots. Peaked cap, wide belt, with a U.S. brass buckle. Canvas leggings, rolled blanket over the shoulder, just so. Then in the cracked mirror over her bureau, she sized herself up, studying her reflection from different angles. Convincing, no doubt about it. Emma Edmonds was gone, and in her place stood Private Franklin Thompson, 2nd Michigan Volunteers, U.S. Army. Marching around the little room, getting used to the new uniform, Emma felt more comfortable and sure of herself. Her masquerade, starting as an impulsive, daft sort of idea, had suddenly become real. Outside her window, a party of young recruits tramped by, their arms loaded with gear, their voices raised in harmony. "We will welcome to our ranks all the loyal, true, and brave, shouting the battle cry of freedom. And although they may be poor, not a man shall be a slave, shouting the battle cry of freedom." Emma tried to join in, but her mouth was dry. Her heart pounded and she felt lightheaded. Was it joy or fear? She couldn't rightly say. Odd how both those emotions had symptoms in common. But no matter, the important thing was that her scheme had worked. So far, she was safe. Emma started in the mirror again, tilted her cap at a jaunty devil may care angle, and smiled, wondering what her father would say if he could see her now. She felt a great rush of excitement and happiness. The imp voice had pulled her from the sidelines, and the adventure was beginning. Of course, there would be problems. There were bound to be. But she wasn't worried. At least, not too much. Whatever trouble or dangers might be waiting, Emma knew somehow she'd manage to face them. Standing at the window, she could still hear the volunteers singing in the distance. She drew a long, slow breath. This morning she'd taken a soldier's solemn oath. Now there was no turning back. For better or worse, Miss Edmonds was going to war.